So I'm going to spare you my Forrest Gump impersonation, but I do want to recall that scene from the movie when Forrest Gump goes up to Jenny's grave and he tells her, "Jenny, I don't know if it was Mama who was right or if it was Lieutenant Dan. I don't know if we have a destiny or if we're all just floating around all accidental-like on a breeze. But maybe it's both. Maybe both is happening at the same time." Well, whether both is happening at the same time or not, it certainly can feel like it, can't it? On the one hand, we can feel God's hand at work in things, or we at least try to affirm it. But then on the other hand, we wonder, is God working at all? How could he let this happen? Whatever this is. Is it accidental? Or is it destiny? Or is it both in some way? Well, those familiar with Esther's story, you might remember how through a series of events, seemingly random events maybe, Esther, a Jew, becomes the queen. She becomes a part of the royal family. You might also remember from Esther's story, Haman and his pride, his hatred for all the Jews, really. But really, the people didn't like the Jews. They found themselves under foreign rule in the Persian Empire. Nobody really liked them, though. This is why Esther and Mordecai kept their Jewish identity a secret for so long, or at least at first. Haman disliked Mordecai and the Jews so much that he hatched this plan to wipe them all out, a plan that he got the king to sign off on, and a plan that was set for a particular day. But what's interesting is how the day of the Jews' demise was determined. It was determined by what they called basically casting lots, throwing some dice, just like how they cast lots to determine who would get Jesus' clothes after the crucifixion, just like the disciples, how they decided who was going to replace Judas, basically leaving it to chance. The day that the Jews would die would be determined by a die. Or would it? Or would it? Well, perhaps you might also remember how Mordecai gets into the good graces of the king because he lets the king know about this plan that two of the king's guards had to try to kill the king. But up to this point, Haman's evil plan is still in effect. That is until Esther steps up. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people. That is my request." So right here, this is where Esther sort of blows her Jewish cover. "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace, but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then the king said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." And you read through the lectionary passage, and it reminds us that this day or this month that had been turned from them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor. Now you might have noticed in our passage today, but it's actually true of the entire book of Esther, that nowhere in it is God mentioned, not once. But a big but. Just like God can seem absent from our lives, it doesn't mean that he's not there. In the book of, or in his notes on the book of Esther, John Wesley noted how God's finger is directing events. So basically, there's, behind the scenes, God is at work. There is a divine plan, or to maybe use a better word, a divine ordering of things. There is this divine plan, but it's not one that has us to just sort of throw our hands up and say it is the way it is. But it's a divine plan that has us to faithfully respond moment by moment, day by day, just like Esther did. You see, because instead of stepping up like she did, Esther could have just stepped back, right? She could just step back and said, well, I guess Haman's plan is part of God's plan. This was just meant to be, this awful thing that's happening. Well, what have we done now? This terrible thing just must be meant to be. But no, she doesn't go down that road. She recognized that just because something happened or is unfolding in a particular way doesn't necessarily mean that it's happening or happened the way God originally wanted it to. She knew enough about her God to act in the confidence that this awful thing just was not meant to be. Just like how we can say with confidence, certainly after learning more about God through the heart of Christ, that certain things were just not meant to be, like the Holocaust. Surely we can have enough confidence to say that this was not meant to be, or for children to be born with life-threatening illnesses or diseases, or for children to not be born at all because their lives are taken from them because they're not wanted for whatever reason. Surely this is not a part of God's plan, the way he set things up to be in the very beginning, a part of his divine ordering of things. Or a lot of other things for that matter. Is it a part of God's plan for innocent civilians to get bombed in a drone strike? Is it part of God's plan for hundreds of thousands to die from a virus for which there is now a vaccine? Or for hundreds of thousands of acres to burn to the ground? We could go all the way back to Adam and Eve. Was it a part of God's plan for them to be disobedient? Do we get off the hook as long as our disobedience leads to some better thing later? And it doesn't even have to be these tragic events. You can sort of poke holes at the idea that just because something happened, God wanted it to, by thinking about some trivial things. Is it part of God's plan for the Panthers to be 2-0? I don't mind that. I'm a Panthers fan. That's fine with me. But does that mean God doesn't care an awful lot for the Jets or for the Saints? What does it mean for my poor alma mater, Western Carolina, just absolutely getting whooped by Oklahoma the other day? I think it was like 76-0. I mean, is God that much of an Oklahoma fan? Or could Western have shown up a little bit that day? Could they have scored at least a touchdown or two? Now, these are hard questions. How much are we responsible for, and how much is God responsible for? We may never have a satisfying answer to that question, but I think the book of Esther can sort of point us in the right direction, at least. You remember those dice that they threw, that they rolled, casting lots, they called it, to determine the day that the Jews would die? Well, it happens back in chapter 3 of Esther, so if you want to look there with me, it's around verse 7. It says, in front of Haman, they threw namely dice, in front of Haman to find the best day for his plan, for Haman's plan. They tried every day and every month, and the dice chose the 13th day of the 12th month. Well, then a lot happens. We flip over several pages, go through several chapters here. Things turn for the good for the Jews. It's Haman who's killed, not Mordecai. Mordecai is given the authority to sort of lead the Jews in seeking not revenge, but just being able to defend themselves, really. But now look over at chapter 9, verse 1. Something ought to sound familiar. It was on the 13th day of the 12th month that the king's order, so this is his new order, the new order for the Jews to be able to defend themselves, not to be slaughtered and killed. The king's order and his law were to be enforced. On the very day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to overpower them, the tables were turned against them. The Jews overpowered their enemies instead. So you see what happened. The day the dice chose for the Jews to die becomes instead the day the Jews would live. So the dice, or those who threw them, had a certain plan in mind, a certain purpose for the day. But as far as God was concerned, the purpose that day was not death for God's people, but life. And at the same time, by the time we get to the end of the book, don't we know the answer to Mordecai's question that he poses to Esther back in chapter 4 when he is addressing Esther? Take a look at that real quick over in chapter 4. He says, if you don't speak up at this very important time, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place, but you and your family will die. But who knows? Maybe it was for a moment like this that you came to be a part of the royal family. In other words, God didn't compel Haman to plot against his own people. God's not responsible for the evil he allows to happen, but he knew it would happen. And because God's purposes are about life and relief and rescue, it says in chapter 4 as well, God is going to raise up somebody, and it could be you, Esther. It could be you, Esther, Mordecai counsels. Mordecai's question is still a good one, though, even for us. Even in the midst of our tragedies and crises, it's still a good question for God's people. How is God calling you to help him bring the good out of the mess? I went back and forth on whether or not to share this, but my cousin and her husband, they were going to name their son Isaiah, and they had actually just had a baby shower for him and everything. But unfortunately, she went into the doctor because she was having some abdominal pain. And I just want to read for you the words that she shared to friends and family. She said, we learned that our precious baby boy no longer had a heartbeat. He was with us for 27 weeks before he went to be with Jesus in heaven. After 2 days in the hospital inducing labor, it was time. Isaiah entered the world. He weighed 2 pounds, 8 ounces, and was 16 inches long. He was the most beautiful, perfect baby boy. He had a big nose like his daddy and long toes like his mommy. We got to spend several hours with him before we said our goodbyes. This has been the hardest battle we have ever faced in our lives. Although we don't understand it, we know God is in control and has a plan for us. I decided to share that because my cousin's faith that this tragedy can be used and redeemed by God for his ultimate purposes of life and relief and rescue is such an incredible witness to the fact that God does have a plan for us. God has a plan for you, even in a time such as this. Amen.